The first load came to her gate as a joke, and she thanked the man who brought it. It was the tail end of April in the year 1902, and the mill wagon came up the Yellow Run Road with its bed heaped so high that the top pieces slid off at every rut. Slabwood. The curved outside cuts a saw throws down before it ever gets to a board. Bark on one face, raw white on the other. Crooked as a dog's hind leg and not worth the nail you would drive into it. The company burned that stuff. It kept a brick burner out behind the sorting shed shaped like a beehive with a screen cap on top, and from one May to the next a lazy gray feather stood over it, and every man in the valley had grown up thinking of slab as he thought of the peel he cut off a potato. Cass Haskell drove the wagon. He was the yard foreman at Merrick Bend, broad through the shoulders, and he owned a laugh that carried farther than his speaking voice. He stopped at the widow's gate and did not climb down. He pulled the pin at the back of the bed and let the whole load go in one long, roaring slide, and it came off the tail of that wagon and stacked itself crossways over the mouth of her lane until a wheelbarrow could not have passed. "There is your fortune, Mrs.," he called. Compliments of the company. The two men on the seat beside him were laughing before he finished the sentence. It was a good joke in the yard that spring, the widow and her scrap. She had been coming down to the burner since the ice went out of the run, 3 days a week and sometimes 4, on foot with a hand sled while the mud lasted and with a 2-wheeled cart after the road firmed, and she filled whatever she brought with the culls the Sawyers pitched down the chute. Nobody stopped her. There was no reason on earth to stop her. It cost the company money to burn it. Lavina Tandy came out of her kitchen door drying her hands on her apron. She was 68 years old that spring, and she looked every hour of it, a short, square woman gone gray at the temples, with a face weathered brown and lined deep from the cheekbone down. She wore what she wore every day, a brown wool dress with the hem let out twice, a coarse cream apron over it, a faded bonnet tied under her chin, and boots that had been resoled by a man who was no longer living. She walked down the lane and looked at the pile a long moment, the way a buyer looks at a thing. "That is a kindness," she said. "If you have more of it, I will take more of it." Haskell was still grinning when he turned the team, and he was still grinning at supper when he told it. But he came back. That was the part nobody thought about at the time. Any teamster with an empty run and a burner load to be rid of could save himself the trip out back and dump it at the widow's gate instead, and get a story out of it besides. Before the leaves turned, the yard had sent better than 300 loads up that hill, laughing every mile of it. And before the next April, those same men would be standing in that lane with their hats in their hands, counting out $15 a cord for wood they had thrown away. Her place was 40 acres of thin upland on the north side of the run, a quarter-mile above the mill and a good climb from it. Her husband, Ira, had been a millwright, a quiet man who could hear a bearing going bad from across a floor, and he had died 9 years back in the winter of a chest complaint that took him in 11 days. He left her the 40 acres, a house with 4 rooms and a summer kitchen, an empty barn, a spring house, and no cash whatever. What he also left her, though it took her a while to understand it as a legacy, was an education in how wood behaves. Ira Tandy had spent his working life inside the smell of sawn timber. He knew which log would check and which would hold, why a board cups toward the bark, how long green stuff has to stand before it stops fighting you. He talked about it at the table the way other men talk about weather. Lavina had listened for 31 years, mostly while doing something else with her hands, and she had absorbed the whole of it without ever once thinking she was being taught. The valley had gone over to hard coal about the time the branch line came in. That was the thing to understand about Merrick Bend. 15 years of sawing had taken the hillsides down to brush and stumps and second growth no thicker than your wrist, and what standing timber remained belonged to the company and was worth too much to burn. So the grates were changed out. Stoves were fitted with coal linings. Every kitchen in the township learned the particular ring of a scuttle being filled, and every household in it bought from the same shed at the depot, because Orville Keel had the coal trade in that valley and no one else had any part of it. Keel was a heavy man of about 50 who wore a black coat winter and summer and kept his ledger on a nail behind the shed door. He was not a cruel man in any way you could have written down. He simply had the only warm thing for sale within 11 miles, and he had held that position long enough that he had stopped noticing he held it. Lavina had bought from him for 9 winters, and every one of those winters had cost her something she could not spare. Coal ran $4.50 a ton at the shed in an ordinary year, and a house her size ate 5 tons between October and April. And there was no season in which $22 was a thing she had lying about. She had sold the last of Ira's tools to make the payment 2 winters running. In March, when the money was gone and the weather was not, she had burned fence rails off her own line and then gone out in the wet and cut green sapling stuff that hissed and steamed and gave off about as much heat as a lamp. That was the winter she began to think about the burner. She went down in the 3rd week of March, when the run was still noisy with meltwater, and she stood outside the sorting shed and watched a man pitch 4 barrel loads of trimmed slab down a chute onto the burn pile, a fire that existed for no purpose except to make the slab disappear. She watched for the better part of an hour. Then she went and found the yard clerk and asked him what the company charged for it. He laughed at her. He was not being unkind either. He genuinely thought she had made a joke, and when he understood she had not, he told her to take all she could carry and welcome, and then he went and told 3 other men about it, and that was how the whole thing started. She began the first Monday in April with the sled and a length of harness strap. Here is what she understood that nobody else in that valley troubled to think about, because there was no money in thinking about it. Slab is thin. A slab off the outside of a log is an inch or 2 through at the fattest part and tapers away to nothing at the edges, and thin wood dries fast. Cordwood cut from a standing tree in the spring will not be fit to burn until the 2nd winter, and everybody knows that, and so everybody assumed that the mill's leavings were just as green and just as useless. But a stick that thin, ricked up off the ground in the open air with the wind through it, is done by August. One summer takes it from wet to ringing. She had heard Ira say so at a supper table years before, in a conversation about nothing at all. So she was not gathering trash. She was gathering next winter, and she was gathering it in April, which meant it had the whole of the hot months to finish. The work itself was plain, and it was heavy, and it did not stop. She left the house at first gray with the sled or the cart, went down the hill empty and came back up it loaded, and the coming back was the whole of the labor because the grade out of the mill flat is steady for a quarter mile. She wore a strap across her chest and over one shoulder, and she leaned into it, and she took the hill in sections with a breath between. When the loads began arriving at her gate on the company's wagons, she stopped making the trip down and started spending the whole day at the sawbuck instead, which was worse. She cut everything to stove length with a buck saw. She built 2 more bucks out of the crookedest pieces so she could keep 3 going and shift between them when her shoulders gave out. Anything thicker than her wrist she split. Bark and edgings and the shattery ends went into grain sacks for kindling. And the sawdust, which was the part the whole valley would have laughed hardest at, she hauled in barrels and hogsheads and stored dry on the barn floor, because Ira had once shown her how a stove packed with damp sawdust around an upright can, with the can pulled out to leave a chimney down the middle, will hold a fire from banking time until morning without a soul touching it. The ricking was the part she took seriously. She set 2 stakes and laid a bottom course of the worst pieces crossways to keep the rest off the ground. She built each rick 4 feet high and 8 feet long and no deeper than a stick, ends open to the west wind that came up the run every afternoon, bark side up on every course so the rain shed off instead of standing. She left a full hand's width between one rick and the next. By the 1st of June there were 4 of them along the south fence. By the middle of July there were 11, and the line of them reached from her gatepost nearly to the corner of the spring house, and you could see them from the bridge below. Twice that summer she thought she had lost the whole of it. The first was a 3-day rain at the end of June that came in flat off the west and drove up under the bark on the top courses, and she went out into it at 10 o'clock at night in Ira's oilskin and turned the top course of every rick she could reach and set the rest on edge. It was dry again by the following Tuesday, and she never lost a stick. The second was the last week of July, when the run went low and the grass went brittle and there was heat lightning over the ridge 4 nights running, and she carried buckets up from the spring house and wet the ground between the ricks every evening for a week, and slept badly through all of it, because the one thing Orville Keel ever said about her that was worth anything was true. A stacked hillside will go up. Her hands went first. By the middle of June, the web between her thumb and finger had split open on both hands, and she bound them with strips off a flour sack and kept sawing. Her right shoulder gave out in July, and she taught herself to pull the saw left-handed for half of every day. She lost 11 pounds between April and September on eggs and bread and whatever the garden managed, and Vernie Bledsoe was not the only one who noticed it, only the one who said it out loud. There was nothing pleasant about that summer, and she never once claimed there was. She got up in the dark, she went down to the buck, she stopped when the light was gone. Then she came in and set the bread and did the milk and mended, and got up again. That was when the talking started in earnest. Children counted her ricks on their way home from the schoolhouse and reported the number at supper, and the number kept going up, and it got to be a thing people said. Vernie Bledsoe, who farmed the next place over and had known Lavina since both of them were girls, came across the field in August with a basket of beans she did not really need to deliver. "Lavina," she said, "I am going to say a thing, and you may take it however you like. It looks poor. That is all. It looks poor from the road, and it is the first thing anybody sees coming up this way, and there is talk that you are hard put." "I am hard put," Lavina said. "I have been hard put since '93. "Well," said Vernie, and stopped, because there was nowhere for the sentence to go from there. In the town it was funnier. At the depot they called the south fence the widow's fortune, and men would ask Keel whether he was worried about the competition, and Keel would take his time about answering because he enjoyed the setup. "I will tell you what I am worried about," he said one Saturday, with 6 or 7 standing around. "I am worried about the fire. She has got that whole hillside stacked with burner scrap, and one dry August lightning strike will take the road out. Somebody ought to speak to her for her own good. Nobody spoke to her." But the sentence went around, and it got repeated in the shape it took after 4 or 5 tellings, which was that the widow Tandy had gone strange up there and was hoarding rubbish, and that it was a shame, and that the place had been kept respectable when Ira was living. She went into the store on the first Saturday in September for saw teeth and a can of oil, and there were 5 men around a stove that had not been lit yet, and the talk stopped when the bell went over the door and started up again about 10 seconds later, which is worse than it not stopping. "Mrs. Tandy," one of them said. "There is a question going around." "I expect there is," she said. "How many cords have you got up there?" "I have not measured it." "Well," he said, "the boys have it at 40, and I have it at better than 60, and there is $1 writing on the answer." Lavina counted her money onto the counter for the oil and waited on her change. "You will know by March," she said. That got a laugh, because they took it for the sort of thing a person says when the answer has run out. Loomis wrapped the saw teeth in paper and then told her the joke going around at the depot, the one about the fire, because he thought she ought to hear it from somebody who wished her well. She thanked him for it and said Keel was right about the risk and that she was wetting the ground of an evening. She walked home with the oil in her apron pocket, and on the last rise she stopped and looked back at the south fence from above the bridge, at the long line of ricks gone silver gray where the sun had got at them all summer, and she counted them, which she had just finished telling a room full of men she had never done. Lavina heard most of it. Merrick Bend was not a town where a thing stayed unheard. She kept sawing. In August, a boy named Milt Larkin started coming up the hill after his shift, because he had watched her from the yard all summer and had reached the age where a thing like that begins to bother a person. He was 17, and he ran the tail end of a crosscut on her woodpile from 6 until dark for his supper and $1 a week, and neither of them said much during it. And by the end of the month, the two of them could put through in an evening what she had been putting through in a day and a half. The mines had quit in May. Nobody in the valley made much of it at first. The papers came up on the branch line 2 days late, and the strike was a matter for men in another county, and everyone had lived through short stoppages before. And the operator said plainly that it would be settled before harvest. The price at Keel's shed went from $4.50 to $5.25 in June and stood there. In July it went to $7, and there was some grumbling. In August it went to $9. And the grumbling stopped being good-natured, and Keel began saying that he was only passing along what he paid, which was true, and which did not help anybody. Then September went by without a settlement, and in the first week of October, the cars stopped coming to Merrick Bend altogether. Not fewer cars. None. The branch line ran a mixed train up on Tuesdays and Fridays, and the coal gondolas that had been part of it for 15 years simply were not on it. And were not on it the next week either. And Keel stood in the door of his shed on a Friday afternoon, looking down an empty siding with his hands in his coat pockets. He had 31 tons on the ground. He had orders on the nail behind the door for better than 400. The coal quit that autumn, and it quit all at once. The frost came on the 11th of October, which was early, and the hard freeze came in the last week of the month, which was very early. And that was when the whole of Tarbell County discovered at once what it had done to itself over 15 prosperous years. There was no wood. That is a strange thing to say about a place that had grown up around a sawmill, but there was no wood. The hills had been cut over and gone to brush. What was standing was second growth and green. And green wood in October is not fuel. It is a wet stick that makes steam and creosote and a chimney fire. The company's own log deck was worth more than any man in the township could pay, and the company was not selling firewood in any case because the company was selling boards. Fence rails came down all over the valley in November, and after the rails went, the smell of a certain kind of desperation got into the air, which is the smell of varnished furniture burning. The depot on the Friday after the freeze was a thing men described to each other for years afterward. There were 40 or 50 standing on that platform when the mixed train came up, and every one of them watched the cars go past and counted, and there was a flat silence when the caboose cleared the crossing and the count was still nothing. A man named Pell put his fist through the shed door and then apologized for it twice and paid for the door in the spring. 2 brothers off the Ridge Road got hold of the same scale weight and had to be pulled apart. Keel came out and stood on his own steps and told them the plain truth, which was that he had 31 tons on the ground and orders for better than 400 and no authority over a single mile of railroad anywhere in the state, and that he would sell what he had at the posted price in the order the orders stood in the book and not one lump otherwise. To his credit, that is exactly what he did, and he never put a nickel onto those 31 tons. But 31 tons is about 9 days of a hard January for the houses on one street. It was gone by the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. After that the shed stood open and swept and empty, and there was nothing left in that township to put in a firebox but green wood, fence rail, and whatever a family could bring itself to break up. A cord of dry hardwood does about the work of a ton of coal. There was, in the whole of that township, exactly one place where dry hardwood existed in quantity, and it existed because a 68-year-old woman had spent 7 months carrying home what everybody else paid to destroy. Delphia Spear came first, and she came on foot. She was the school teacher, 24 years old, and she had 38 children in one room with a stove in the middle of it and a coal bin that had stood empty since the middle of November. The trustees had told her to dismiss the school. She had not dismissed the school. She walked up the long grade in a coat that was not equal to the day and stood at the gate in front of the ricks with her hands in her sleeves. "I have $4, she said. "It is mine and not the district's. I do not know what a person pays." Lavina looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the ricks. "The price is $15 the cord," she said, "and you take it from the yard yourself, because I have no team. That is for men who can pay it. The schoolhouse is a different article. Send me 2 boys with a wagon on Saturday, and they can load what the stove will hold until March, and you will keep your $4, and if anybody asks you what you paid, you will tell them the same price as everybody, because I will not have that argued in this valley all winter." Delphia Spears stood there and did not manage to say anything at all for a while. "I would like to know how to bank it," she said finally. "Ours goes out by 2 in the morning, and the room is like a well by 8. So Lavina took her into the barn and showed her the sawdust bins, and showed her the can and the packing and the pulling of the can, and sent her home with a sack of it and a lard pail with the bottom cut out. And after that, the schoolhouse stove at Merrick Bend held its fire until morning every night of that winter, which was more than the stove at the back did. After the school teacher, it came in a rush. The first paying customer was a sawyer named Renwick, with a wife 6 months along and a house with a north wall. He came up on a Tuesday evening with a borrowed wagon and $11, and asked for what 11 would buy. Lavina sold him a cord and told him he owed her 4, and he asked when she wanted it, and she said when he had it, and he had it in February. The second was a widow from the Ridge Road who had less than that. The third was a man Lavina had never liked, and she sold to him at 15 without a word about anything, and that was noticed too. A man came over from Kingsley on the second Sunday in December in a good coat with a coffee tin in his lap, and what he wanted was not a cord. He wanted 20, and he had already worked out what 20 would bring on the far side of the ridge, where there was no mill and no widow and no dry wood at all. 30 a cord, he said. 30 cash on the ground, my own men to load, and you never see my face again after Tuesday. Lavina asked him what he meant to charge for it once he had it over the ridge. He told her because he was proud of the arithmetic. She let him get clear to the end of it. "No," she said. He took that for the opening of a negotiation and went to 35, and when that did nothing, he began explaining to her, patiently and at considerable length, that she was an old woman with no notion of what a market was, and that she was throwing $400 into the run out of pure ignorance. "I know what it is," she said. "It is what a man does when he is the only one who has got the thing. It has been done to me every winter I have lived. 15, 1 cord. Load it yourself the same as the schoolteacher's boys did, or you can drive back over the ridge and tell them there." He took the cord. He was cold, too. And while Milt Larkin was helping him rope the load, he said, more to himself than to the boy, that he had never in his life met anybody who would not take money. Milt told him she took money all day long. She just would not take his. She set the price on a Tuesday, and it did not move once between then and March. She could have had 30. That is the thing that ought to be understood plainly. By the first week of December, there were men coming over the hill from Kingsley and from the ridge, and one man drove 11 miles from Corbin Furnace with cash in a coffee tin, and any one of them would have paid double. Keel's coal, when a car finally did come through in January, went at $19 a ton, and nobody thought that was scandalous, because that was simply what the world cost that year. Lavina Tandy sold dry slab wood at $15 a cord from November until the ground broke, to anybody who came up the lane, in the order they came, and she wrote each sale in a school copybook in a hand that sloped backward. The order was the part she would not bend on, and it made her enemies among people accustomed to being first. The bank cashier drove up on a Sunday in January and found 9 wagons ahead of him in the lane and a boy off the Beale place at the head of the line who had walked over at 4 in the morning pulling a handcart. And the cashier explained what his time was worth, and Lavina pointed at the end of the line. He stood in the cold 2 hours and 40 minutes and got his cord and never mentioned it again, though his wife did, at length, for about a year. There was a whole book of rules by Christmas, and everybody in 2 townships knew them. 1 cord to a household until the 2nd week of February. Then, 2. Nothing sold on. Nothing sold at all to a man who would not name the house it was going into. Load from the rick she pointed at, because the April wood was drier than the June wood, and the April wood went to the houses with sickness in them. Load your own wagon, bring your own rope. And if you had no wagon and no money and a stove going out, you were to come up and say so out loud at the kitchen door, because she would not stand there guessing, and she did not intend to have anybody in that valley freeze on account of pride, theirs or hers. Orville Keel came up on the 4th of December. He came in the afternoon in a hired buggy, and he did not stop at the gate as the millmen did. He drove clear up the lane to the kitchen door, and he took off his hat, and he stood in front of a woman he had been selling to for 9 years and had never once in those 9 years walked up a lane to see. "I will come straight at it," he said. "I will buy the pile, all of it as it stands today, and I will send men to move it, and you need not deal with another soul this winter. You are 68 years old, and you are selling wood out of your yard in December to strangers. I will give you $1,800, and you will be shut of it." She let that sit a moment. "What would you sell it at?" she said. "That is my business. It is going to be my business by supper time," she said, "because whatever you charge, it will be my wood they are paying it for. And it will be my name they say when they say it." He put his hat back on. He was not a stupid man, and he could feel the thing turning under him. "$2,200, he said. Lavina wiped her hands on her apron. Behind her, through the kitchen window, the stove was going, and the room was warm enough that the glass had gone soft with steam, and it was the only window on that road that day with steam on it. "Mr. Keel," she said, "you have stood in the door of that shed and told this valley what heat costs for 15 years, and no one ever had the second place to go. There is a second place now, and it is going to stay a second place. $15, the same as any man pays. You may have a cord at that, and if you want it, I will take your money and be glad of it, but you will not have the pile." He bought 2 cords. He paid $30 in the lane in front of Milt Larkin and a man from the Ridge Road who was waiting his turn, and he loaded it himself because his driver was young and slow about it. And by the following Saturday there was not a person between the furnace and the county line who had not heard that Orville Keel had driven up to the Tandy place with an offer in his pocket and come back down with 2 cords of slab and a receipt. Cass Haskell came on a Thursday near the middle of the month. He had 5 in the house and a wife with a cough, and the mill was still running, because a sawmill burns its own leavings, and always has, so he was warm 11 hours a day at the yard and cold the other 13 at home, which is a particular kind of thing to carry around with you. He walked up the lane with his cap off before he was halfway. Lavina was at the buck with Milt. She straightened up and looked at him and waited, and did not help him, and did not have to. "Mrs. Tandy," he said. "Mr. Haskell, I have got money," he said. "I want to say that first. I am not up here asking a favor. I have got money, and I want 3 cords, and I will pay what everybody pays." "15 the cord," she said. "Load from that end, the second rick, the ones with the bark up. Those are the ones from April." He got about 4 sticks into the wagon before he stopped and stood with his hand on the rail. "I hauled that," he said. "That come off the burn pile. That is the load I pitched at your gate, the very one." "The lane is over there," said Lavina, "if you would rather look for a different one." He did not laugh. He loaded his 3 cords and paid his $45 and hauled it home. And going out, he stopped the team at the gatepost and looked at the whole line of ricks along the south fence in the flat December light, 11 of them, and then 9 more inside the barn, and the woodhouse full to the plate, and he sat there long enough that his brother had to say his name twice. By then the burner at the mill had a padlock on it. That happened in the 3rd week of November, and it happened as these things always happen, which is all at once and about 4 months late. Men had started coming for the chute leavings in October, and by November there were fights over it. Actual fights with fists in the sorting shed. And the company put a man on it, and then put a price on it, and then put a lock on it, and sold slab by the wagon load at $3. And every stick of it was wet, because it had come off a saw that week. You cannot burn October wood in December. It does not matter how much of it you have. It steams and blackens the pipe and lies there sulking in the firebox and gives you a room at 50 degrees. And there is not a thing in this world that will hurry it, because what a stick of wood needs is not want, and it is not money. It is July. The valley had had July. The valley had had July for free, standing right there in the open air, and the valley had spent it laughing at a woman dragging a sled. Nobody said that out loud, but there was a stretch of about 3 weeks that winter when Merrick Bend got very quiet on the subject of the widow's fortune. January was the hard month. The thermometer at the depot went to 11 below on the 9th and did not come back above freezing for 19 days, and the run froze solid enough to walk across, which the old men said had happened twice before in their lives. Dr. Ostrander came up the hill on the 12th with his collar up, and he did not want to buy anything. He wanted to tell her that there were 4 houses on the Ridge Road with sickness in them and no fuel in any of them, and that he had been in 3 of those kitchens that morning and had seen his own breath in all 3. "Which 4?" said Lavina. He named them. The third name he named was Bledsoe. Vernie Bledsoe's husband had the pneumonia. He was 61, and he had been laid up 11 days by then, and their boy had gone west 2 years before and had not written since spring, and their wood was fence rail and green oak and a broken cupboard. Lavina sent Milt Larkin down to borrow the Renwick wagon. They loaded 2 cords, and she rode over on top of it, and she carried the first armload into that kitchen herself and put it down beside the stove and built the fire up and stood there until the room came around. Vernie sat in a chair by the bed with her hands in her lap and watched her do it. "I have got about $9, Vernie said. "Keep it," said Lavina. "There is another 2 cords coming Thursday, and there is sawdust in the sack for the night, and I will show you the can." Vernie began to say something about August and about the beans and about looking poor from the road. "The damper on this stove is stiff," said Lavina. "You want to work oil into it, or you will be fighting it all winter." And that was the whole of what was ever said about it, by either of them, then or afterward. She gave away 19 cords that winter. They are in the copybook in the same backward hand as everything else, with a line drawn through the price. The schoolhouse, the 4 Ridge Road houses, a family named Beale whose barn had gone down, and the church, which got 4 cords for the Sunday room in January because the preacher had held service in his overcoat twice, and Lavina had opinions about that. The rest she sold. 212 cords between the 10th of November and the 22nd of March at $15 to 130 separate households in the order they arrived at her gate. 85 barrels of sawdust at $1 the barrel besides, mostly to women who had learned about the can from the schoolteacher and had come to see about it themselves. $3,265. She counted it twice on the kitchen table on the last Saturday in March in bills and coin out of a stone crock, with Milt Larkin sitting across from her because she wanted a second pair of eyes on the arithmetic. It came to more money than Ira Tandy had earned in the last 9 years of his life. It came to more money than the mill paid Cass Haskell in 7 years of foremanship. It came out of a fire that had been burning behind the sorting shed since before she was widowed, that everyone in the valley had walked past every working day, that the company had paid a man wages to feed. She put $200 of it in front of Milt and told him it was his and that he would take it, and when he started to argue, she said that a man who runs the tail of a crosscut from 6 until dark, from August to Christmas, is not receiving charity. He is being paid late. And that ended it. He bought his mother a stove with the coal grate taken out of it. She paid off the last of what she owed Keel from the winter of 1900, which was $14, and had been on that nail behind his door for 2 years, and she paid it in person and got a receipt. She bought a team and a wagon in April. a pair of grade geldings, and a running gear off a farm sale at Corbin Furnace, and after that she did not carry anything up that hill on a strap again. And in the second week of April, a man came up from the mill office with a paper. The company had done its sums over the winter. The company had watched a padlocked burner and a $3 wagon load and a fist fight in its own sorting shed. And the company had reached the conclusion that it had been standing on money since 1887. So the paper offered Lavina Tandy the season's slab and sawdust, all of it, delivered to her gate on company wagons on company time for $400 the year. She read it twice at the kitchen table and made 2 changes with a pencil. She struck out the delivery clause and wrote in that the loads were to come up in April, May, and June, and not in October, because wood that arrives in October is worthless to anybody, and she was not going to pay $400 to be handed a problem. And she wrote in that the sawdust was to be kept under the shed roof and not left in the weather, because wet sawdust is a compost heap and dry sawdust is a night's sleep. The man from the office took the paper back down the hill, and it came up again signed. So the wagon started again on the 21st of April, up the Yellow Run Road, the same road and mostly the same teamsters, with the beds heaped so high that the top pieces slid off at every rut. Only now they were paid to make the trip, and they took the loads where she told them and not where it amused them, and they stacked the bottom course crossways off the ground because she stood there and watched them do it until they got it right. Cass Haskell drove the first one. He stopped at the gate, and this time he climbed down. "Where do you want it?" he said. She pointed at the south fence, past the 11 bare stake lines where last year's ricks had stood all winter and were gone now, every stick of them burned in 130 kitchens across 2 townships. "Start there," she said, "and leave a hand's width between." He started there, and he left a hand's width between.